All right, I think we can get us started. Hello, everyone. I know we have many international audience members today from very different time zones, so thank you all so much for joining us. We are incredibly excited to welcome you to the Accumulation of Waste, a political economy of genocide and imperialism. My name is Helyeh Doutaghi. I am the Deputy Director of the Law and Political Economy Project, or the LPE Project, as more often known. The LPE Project is a group of legal scholars, students, and practitioners that start from a recognition of law's central role through both policy and ideas in the creation and perpetuation of economic precarity, racial and gender subordination, political alienation, and environmental catastrophe. We aim to help reserve these trends by supporting a scholarship and pedagogy that maps where we have gone wrong and that develops ideas and proposals to democratize our political economy and build a more just, equal, and sustainable future with critical attention to the need for power and movement building as part of any such transformation. If you're interested in any of this work or would like to learn more or get involved, you can check the LPE blog, as well as the project's website, which provide virtual courses, archived events, and a variety of programs and courses that we have offered and will be offering in the future. So please check those out. And if you are a law student, we have student chapters across the country, as well as some international chapters in many law schools. We also have an at-large student group for those who don't have a chapter in their law schools and would like to get involved. So feel free to reach out to us about any of these. All right, so with that, I'll turn to today. We are incredibly excited and honored to have two brilliant scholars of political economy with us, Professor Ali Kadri and Dr. Max Eil, neither of whom need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Ali Kadri is a professor at Yat-sen University. He's the author of several books, including A Theory of Forced Labor Migration, The Proletarianization of the West Bank Under Occupation, 1967 to 1992, and Arab Development Denied, as well as several other books. He has written extensively on the political economy of war and the development in West Asia. We're also honored to have Dr. Max Eil here with us, a senior fellow at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies, University of Ghent, and an associate researcher at the Observatory of Food Sovereignty and the Environment, as well as the Marian Center for Advanced Studies in the Maghreb, Tunis. He has authored A People's Green New Deal and recently wrote Palestine's Great Flood and works on the themes of political ecology. He's also an associate editor of Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. Professor Kadri will start us with presenting for about 20 to 30 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of comments and questions from Max, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience for the remainder of the time, depending on how much time we have left. All right, Ali, take it away.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, there is a lot to say on how one should visualize the conditions of global society and the conditions of the planet. You know, perspectives are always class-based perspectives. How one thinks of how things are. You know, the prognosis would be for some people that technology will basically solve all our problems in the future. Well, these people forget that technology is also a tool, a class tool. It's below, you know, it's in the hands of people who earn and make a living by putting technology to the wrong use, as has been happening, you know, for 5 centuries now. Things will not be better. There will not be meliorism. Things will not get better with technology, because technology, again, is just a tool to get things done, to accumulate with and to get things done. And that's one class perspective. Another class perspective, you know, reactionary like class perspective would be, you know, that somehow mankind eschatological type of argument that somehow mankind is destined to perish, and these are just signals and significations of that. That's too silly to ponder, really. I mean, you know, it's not something science can approach. There is the other perspective, the other class perspective, the people's perspective on things. And, you know, if we look at the global society and we look at the conditions of the planet, well, you know, and this is a much more reasoned and a much more thorough perspective on things, is that the conditions of the planet, as we all know, by consensus, are not all that good. And in 50 years or 60 years time, you know, all these reports on the environment say that things are rather on a downhill sort of decline, and the social conditions as well. The social conditions are also quite not well, so to speak. I mean, there's massive global unemployment, many wars, and if you look at the daily structural genocide rate, the death from hunger, the death from disease, the death from all the things that we could easily cure or prevent, they're in the millions every day. I mean, somebody I was just reading, somebody calculated that in 2 years, capitalism kills 100 million people in structural genocide. Basically, you know, so when we, you know, so that's the situation, right? So we have, and over, you know, when we look at history, we sort of look at certain phenomena that characterize a certain period in history, and then we periodize that. You know, we say there's a period that started, let's say, at around the 16th century up until now, where the production relations, the way we as a society maintain ourselves from time to time, has changed. We no longer produce rice and wheat to eat. We produce rice and wheat to sell, and then we take the wages. So there's something about exchange value taking precedence and supplanting use value. So we don't produce things for our own use. We produce things to sell. And that essential change in the way society maintains itself is quite different from anything that superseded it, and it has brought, it has not, you know, in a sense, it has released new developments in technology and produced a lot of good things, a lot of wealth, a lot of machines and goods that could better man's life. But at the same time, it has produced a lot of death and a lot of environmental destruction. By now, we probably know from that working class, from that global society's perspective, that we have produced so much unwanted death and so much of man and nature. There are so many people who die prematurely, and there is so much of nature that unnecessarily dies in order to make things to sell. And sadly enough, the things that, you know, the pollution that we produce and the trash that we produce and the wasted life that are being produced by the system, which is governed by that social relations, which says, look, we're no longer going to make things to use, but we're going to make things to sell. That's the primary concern of the social system. It is to sell and make profits. With that condition in mind, then we must use inputs. We must use human labor inputs and natural inputs. The cheapest rates. We don't want to pay much for labor, and we don't want to pay much for the trees that we chop or the pollution that we produce and things like that, because we need to cut costs to make a profit. And in the process, we ended up creating much more wasted lives and wasted nature than the good things, the same things that we have produced to support life and to support on the planet or global society. We have had, and if we, and the issue, to go back to the point, the issue is the waste that we have produced is also priced. You know, if I was selling, for instance, this pen, well, for $1 or something like that, I understand this pen sells for $1, I'm going to make money off of it or something like that, if I was an industrialist. But at the same time, the trash and the pollution and the social problems that have been created that destroy people also sell. We now know that, for instance, carbon is paid for. When there is an illness from the pollution, it is paid for. When there is we know that the price system, that, capital, the principal relation that organizes life, which seeks to make profits at the cheapest cost, which means that we need to cheapen the environment and to cheapen the costs of labor. And the way we do this, unfortunately, is literally by suppressing labor. And if we have trees in somewhere in the developing world and we need those trees, how are we going to get the trees cheap? We're going to go there and negotiate with people. But if they're autonomous and sovereign, they're going to ask for a high price. But what should we do to get them to give us the trees for a very cheap price so that we can make profits when we compete in the global markets? Well, we should, literally sometimes we bomb them as per the usual, there was colonialism, genocides, and all these things. Sometimes you eliminate these people. So, the idea of extractivism is much talked about, but it so appears, we don't go to extract copper or timber or something like that. The first thing that's being extracted, and it's not mentioned often, is the extraction of human lives. Because there are people everywhere, and that these people are in unity with the nature. They are subjects of that nature. They are the self in that nature. They own that nature. They inhabit that nature, and their nature themselves, but they're subjects because they're conscious, and they're organized in social forms of organization. So we need to defeat them and deconstruct, undo their forms of social organization that give them any sense of sovereignty, any sense of autonomy, so that we can get the things that they have for very cheap prices. And the way that is done usually is by violence. And the violence itself, when we send armies and we give these armies machines to use, and that's industrial scale violence. So it's an industry, and what it does, it extracts. The first thing that is extracted is the life of man, in a sense, before the extraction of the copper or the tin or whichever metal or whichever thing that we're extracting. And in that process, why we do that is it's because we are going to, we need to subdue the society that lives abroad, or which is in unity and subject of that nature. We need to subdue it in order to get the things that they have for very cheap prices, in order to compete in the global market. But what I was saying earlier, I haven't forgotten what I was saying earlier, is that capital commodifies everything. Well, the reason is why CO2 sells, and trash sells, and everything sells, and water sells, and air sells, and all these things sell. It's because capital is a totalizing social relationship. It sits in, when we consider society as a pyramid of social relations, a totality of social production relations, we consider there's atop that pyramid a specific social relation, which we call the capital relation, which says, look, there is somebody who, there's a society that's producing. And there's some private proprietors who are going to take what this society produced. So it's the expropriation of socially produced wealth. That's what capital is, and it's capital as a social relationship. And it's a contradiction because there are private proprietor and social labor, and capital is essentially, in grosso modo, that contradiction, and it sits atop the pyramid of social relations. And it's this contradiction that that governs the whole process, and it's totalizing. It permeates, and it's incipient. It governs the whole process of life. Everything is made to sell, and the more things we can check to sell, the better. So it's totalizing. It wants to take everything under its wings, and it wants to make everything a commodity, something to sell, and it wants to sell it for a price. There is more money being created, and the symbol of profits is the sum of money that's being created in excess of the costs when we have sales. So the more commoditizing capital is, the better it is for profits as well. It's an expansion in both. You need to make profits by making labor work harder, and live a shorter life over. Because if you think about labor producing a commodity in 8 hours, or and he's being paid 4 hours, and the 4 hours, the surplus labor is what goes to the capitalist, and that transmutes into surplus value, and later into profits. This relationship, when you think of society altogether, when we think of society altogether, then it is society's time that's being put into production. And society's time is the time of life. It's when society is born, and how well it lives, and when it's going to die, and so on and so forth. So it's over that life cycle. So if you think about the time labor puts in order to produce surplus value, to be shortchanged, one of the ways in which surplus value could be produced over the span of time of society altogether, when we consider that the laborer is really the whole of society, and it's living over a generation or two, that is, when we consider not production per se, but social reproduction, then what we have is a situation where, if society contributes a lot in goods that sell and then dies early, then such that it doesn't consume a lot of the money that it has created and a lot of the wealth that it has created, then that's good. It leaves more for capital. One of the examples that is given to illustrate this is somebody who has paid into a pension fund all his life, but he dies the day that he's supposed to receive the pension fund. So the pension fund, and he has no one to benefit from the pension fund. So the pension fund goes to the financial institutions, and so this premature death of society, in a sense, is the time of work of society that is going to be paid for, and the time that society is supposed to live up to under normal or sane conditions is the time that is potentially it's going to earn more money or something like that. So generally speaking, it's going to leave more money for the capitalist class when society dies early. So that said, I'm going to go back to hit on the same point again here, which is the point that it commodifies everything. That capital is totalizes and commodifies everything. So by saying it makes everything into a commodity, that means it sets a price on everything, because a commodity is something specific. It's not it is a product intended to be sold. So if it is a product intended to be sold, it could be sold today, tomorrow, the day after. So it must have a price. That price could be implicit, could be, you know, something we don't see, or could be explicit. When I go to the store to buy this pen for $1, for instance, that's an explicit price. I see it. It says $1. It symbolizes something, you know, and of course the price is $1 because, you know, the capitalist paid only 50 cents, and he made 50 cents for it in costs, and he sold it for $1. So there's 50 cents in profits. What this conceals is all the costs of productions that haven't been covered by the capitalist when he produced this pen. He paid very low wages, such that people didn't live long and better lives. He destroyed the environment and all of these costs, which society is going to handle afterwards, at the time and afterwards, and pay for these costs that otherwise the producer of the pen, which is the capitalist and the industrial, should have paid for. That is not a question of externality that neoclassical gibberish talks about, right? Because in the neoclassical world, the individual is an abstract individual who has nothing to do with society. He comes from outer space. Whereas what we're saying here is that we have society that lives in real people, that is people who are in relation with each other, that live in real time and who are producing, and they as a class lack the political power to determine who is going to pay the true cost of the pen to society. So because they are weak and embattled and cannot put up a fight, they will end up paying for the terrible wages that the capitalists who made the pen and all the diseases, that the pollution from the pen, and when the pen is thrown away, or you know, somebody is going to pick up the trash, and because the pen contains some deadly material in the future, even our, you know, so in social reproduction, the price system of that pen is not only the $1 that we paid for now. We're going to be paying for it. We paid more for that pen in the past, and we're going to end up paying more for that pen in the future. That pen is the price, you know, the $1 price that I paid is simply a mystification, a veneer that hides all the past costs, social costs and environmental costs, and all the future social and environmental costs for that pen. So that $1. So there are many prices associated with that pen, and these prices are real. Sometimes we don't see them, but they impact other prices. For instance, in wars, war is industrial scale killing. It's an industry, and war impacts the price system everywhere. You don't see that, for instance, when by industrial scale atrocities, we don't see that the collapse of people, the defeat of the masses in imperialist wars, it generates repercussions of loss of power throughout the international proletariat, leaving more for capitalists at every step of production, at every stage of production, because of the de-sovereignization, the de-autonomy of the masses. That victory of capital is going, and so the war itself, it factors in terms of the power it imparts throughout the system in prices that we don't see, in negative prices or positive prices, all sorts of prices. So what I mean to say is the price system is quite pervasive, and it is not observable all the time. I mean, all commodities now, for instance, have a spot and the future price. That sort of situation. There's a spot and the future price. Why aren't there pre-spot and post-future and intermediate prices? That's the price system. Because every social relation is about that capital introduces, is about to commodify something that hasn't been commodified yet, or to basically intensify the commodification process. So we're going to have a price system which is interlocked with the process of commodification everywhere. So prices are like a quantum field. They exist everywhere. And everything is a commodity. And every social relation works on commoditizing things. In that sort of world, the defeat of when labor is no longer in power, when labor as a subject of history, when as opposed to capital, we talked about labor and capital being in opposition, you know, and that being the central social relationship that governs the whole process. When labor is no longer a subject of history, in a world that is governed by capital, whose purpose is to make profits at any cost and to commodify more and more, it means that if I produce things that are of use like you know, this pen, and things that are of disuse, of bad use, like the pollution and the social cost, but the pen, everything has a price, and everything is going to make me a profit. So I am sort of in capital heaven. You know, I have the whole, you know, if I make pollution, I sell it. And if I make premature dead people, I sell them. And if I make, I earn a price and I sell them. Whatever I make when labor, a subject of history, is weak, whatever capital makes, it will be able to sell. When labor is not weak, and that's the potential of history, when the international proletariat gains consciousness and sees that this whole process is really detrimental and it's degenerative, it's something like a negative dialectic where things go from bad to worse. And it's very easy to see that things are going from bad to worse, at least on the, you know, in relation to the environment. You know, everybody says, look, the future looks pretty bad as it is. So when the international proletariat realizes that this is the case, simply the simple realization of this fact will overturn the situation. You know, sometimes hypothetically, you might not need and struggle to defeat capital, although capital reigns absolutely by violence. People, you know, the masses are not ignorant, they're not stupid, but the masses are defeated, and their defeat is essentially a defeat by the exercise of military violence. The 900 bases of America here and there, and the, you know, and the ideology of violence and all of this, and the idea that if you move, I will strike you. That is what causes the masses to say, look, we know this is terrible, but there's an American military base nearby. What can we do? And we, you know, of course, they can take our people, you know, as immigrants who work you know, clean the floors in their restaurants, you know, for the white classes in the north. And of course, but they should, you know, to stem the migration from the south to the north, probably they should stem the migration of the NATO forces and the American military bases to the south, because they migrated first, and so they are unwelcome. You know, we should build walls as well. You know, I mean, delinking sometimes it's called. You know, I wish we could build walls, but we cannot build walls. We cannot afford to build walls. We don't have the military power. So there is a necessity, in a sense, hypothetically, the idea that capital is ruinous, that it will lead to a disastrous conditions globally. Premature death means more surplus value over the time span of society. Remember, this is social reproduction, not social production, right? That's what is real. Social production is simply a moment in time, a section of time that we use for illustration. The purpose is to make sure that we understand the process of social reproduction and what causes this process of social reproduction to go from, you know, oh, we have a little bit of good air, but in a few years' time we will have, you know, all the air will be done. And so there is a governing structure for that capital. There's a governing structure, and the governing structure, it has a shape. Its shape is the Western institutions and the Western nations. They're the heirs to the colonial process, which is, and that colonial process is also a knowledge accumulation process. Like technology, Technology is the application of knowledge to produce machines that make things, right? But also there's a store of knowledge of humanity that you control because you have the big universities that, and when science kowtows power, what do you expect? All the big universities will be working for what? To promote the profit-making process at any expense. So, you know, oh yes, we're making science and we have science and I don't know what, but in the end, you know, the big Nobel Prizes are, you know, they're weapons against the environment and society. And that's what, you know, the system is degenerative, and they are integral, the scientists. You know, usually under fascism, we say, we give the example, I always like this example in the sociology of knowledge when it's being taught, that 97% of physicists in fascist Germany were fascist. You know, they followed the power, and 97% of physicists and all scientists nowadays are subservient to the power structure. They get paid. They, you know, that's natural in a sense, in a system of this sort. Now, again, what I need to say is that, well, the process of money making has always involved the process of the eradication of nature, social nature, because man is part of nature. For a long time, you know, many people were genocided since 1500. Now, every class society has its wars, right? But we can't use a broad brush approach to say the same reasons for violence existed before. That when Rousseau spoke about the reasons of war prior to capitalism and around, you know, he says when there is a want, when we don't have enough food here and they have a better crop this year over there, that's when we invade and we take the crop. Now, the reasons for war under capitalism are completely different. They're caused by crisis of overproduction. They overproduce relative to their markets and they need to cut costs. So the overproduction causes the underutilization of productive resources, and it causes and that calls for the cheapening of inputs in order to raise the rate of profit. So you need to increase the rate of exploitation to increase the rate of profits. And you increase the rate of exploitation by, you know, making sure that you repress people into the worst conditions possible. They live shorter lives, or they work longer hours and shorter lives. That sort of thing, right? So that's pretty much the case. And what I mean to say, for a long time, you know, people were being prematurely wasted in genocides and structural genocides. Genocides are the acts of basically eliminating people directly, and structural genocides by causing enough hunger and disease, you know, boycotting them into conditions in which they perish before their time. So war also causes people to perish before their time. It's simply a different time span. It's just making sure that there is a shorter life at different intervals, but it's the same genocidal process. One is called structural genocide, the other is just genocide, for instance. So what we have is a situation where for a long time people which were part of nature were dying out, but no one paid attention to until the time when the environment became sick. And as the environment became sick, the classes that were in cahoots with capital, or they were embodiment of capital, even capitalists being, you know, somewhat of sensing human beings with flesh, they sense that the environment is becoming catastrophic and so on. So they decided to, you know, probably to do something about it. But again, they're not going to do anything about it because the bad environment sells. So they're going to go on to continue to do something about it. There are some people who have a crisis of conscience, in a sense, now because of the environment, but they've never had that crisis of conscience in regards to people in the developing world who are basically perishing way before their time. I tried to summarize many things that I've talked about in a very short time. And
Mhm.
usually I end up, mixing things together. But I'll try to develop these thoughts in the questions and answers. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Ali. This was incredibly rich. And yeah, really, in terms of your ideas and what you have talked about in the book, there is a lot of important point that you touched on, and I also look forward to the conversation and questions. I'm going to turn into Max. Max, please go ahead. And after Max, we're gonna open the floor to questions, and anyone who would like to use the chat box to ask their questions. I'll be reading those after this. Max, all yours.
Thank you, Helyeh, for inviting us here. And thank you, Ali, for that presentation. So I just want to expand and ground upon a few central points from the presentation. And then I want to actually send it back to you, Ali, for a few kind of explications of your points, and especially how they connect to fundamental dynamics that we see in the world today, both the world, the very violent world we live in, and also the world of intellectual production, which is a lubricant and enabler of the world of violence we live in ways that I think are often undernoticed and often looked away from as well. I think that's also a strength of the book, and why it's important that it be circulated outside of, that it be circulated in broader circles. So I think one of the essential contributions of this text, of your work in general, is to really put war and political engineering as part of the kind of process, as part of this totalizing process of value creation, right? Whereas if we take your work and your theory, and your concept formation, and your methodology seriously, it becomes easier for us to understand what's going on in Palestine, for example, which I want to ask you, I'm going to get to and ask you for you to put out your concrete thoughts about. But I think it's very noticeable that, in fact, there's very little debate in the Western left, for example, about why what's going on in Palestine is happening. Someone puts out some quotations from Biden or something from, like, I don't know how old Biden is, from like the late 1960s or something, right? If Biden was alive then, not sure he's alive now either. And this is, imputed to be an argument. And someone else is like, well, we haven't really been discussing these things lately. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. Why not? Why haven't you managed to think about it lately? And someone else is like, well, there is a genocide occurring in the language of international law, and as Marxists, we oppose genocide. And as Marxists, of course, we do oppose genocide, but international law is, of course, not an explanation for why genocides occur in our tools. So I think, all of this, your approach is, of course, super helpful and super illuminating. And probably it's worth adding to people who don't know that Ali's work has circulated a huge amount in the Arab region, where, of course, it's all been translated and it's reviewed rather extensively, for example, in the leading leftist newspapers and Al-Akhbar and elsewhere. And there's a huge debate in circulation. And, if you meet you meet young radicals and anti-imperialists from the Arab region, they'll be like, oh, of course, we're trying to develop the thoughts of Dr. Ali Kadri because it's so fundamental. And it's one of our main theorists who's trying to really develop understanding of our social reality, kind of compare that to where it hasn't really received its due yet, I think, in the West. And so that we really appreciate Helyeh doing this work to try to bring Ali's work into to an audience that needs to hear it. So I also kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, connect it with some other work that may be known to people. I mean, Ali, I think what's really fundamental, and that you're talking about the waste, is also the cutting short of life before what is possible under the giving set of productive forces. And I think this is actually a very central point. I think, you know, this brings into relief why the political sovereignty regime is so important. And if you can, and that's something first, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, but I want you really to expand upon the meaning of the political sovereignty regime from your perspective, because, you know, when I first read your work in, I don't know, 2014 or 15 in Arab Development Denied, I think you made some critical points about the US assault on the political sovereignty regime in the Arab region and the meaning of that for Arab working class development. So, you know, and I've been thinking about that very much with respect to, for example, the work of the Patniks, and how colonialism was actually an exercise in the suppression of food grain absorption by the working class, right? It was also about the resetting of the entire productive forces of colonized countries at a lower level, what you call de-development and what others call de-development. But most as a quantitative index of that, we can really see actually declining lines of food grain absorption. We see it in India, and with also not just the presence of famines, but also the overall declining average access to food grain. We see it in Egypt, we see it in Tunisia, and then, of course, when at the inflection point of political independence, the acquisition of the political sovereignty regime, which is actually out of favor with people in the West who have a political sovereignty regime, right? But they think it's not quite working class enough for people in the third world, that you see actually a rapid ascent in the access to food grains, for example, in India, in Egypt, in some, you know, the worst neo-colonial pro-West dictatorship in the Arab region, practically Tunisia. You see immediately an ascending curve of food grain absorption, which is the fruit of the political sovereignty regime. So I think this is super important, and I would really like you to expand upon how that applies to the contemporary Arab region, where we see it under threat. The other thing, and it's not something you said, but I think it's something someone could perhaps take your work in the wrong direction if they wished, is that we think about the relationship of militarization in terms of inserting it, whether it's pro-systemic or anti-systemic militarization, right? And I think this is super important also. First of all, it's important historically, right? You know, you saw a diversion of labor of value of labor, of the fruits of labor, into industrialization, right? And also in turn into defensive industrialization, both under the Soviet Union and China, right? Which especially in both cases was related to problems in access to food grains. It's sure, we can certainly be clear that happened, but that these were kind of anti-systemic militarizations, which were about defending both the political sovereignty regime and also the processes of socialist construction. And these were actually necessary conditions for working class flourishing, right? And it's the same with wars of national liberation. People die before their historically determined levels under wars of national liberation, but this is actually a necessary condition in order to achieve the political sovereignty regime. So we can't put those deaths under the same categorization as we consider the colonial and neo-colonial and imperial genocides, which are part and parcel of constituting global value relations in the contemporary period, right? So what the points I really think it's important for you to expand upon now, those are just kind of my overall comments and reflections, and as your work relates to current debates, the role of waste and the political sovereignty regime in the Arab region, the role of waste in terms of the destruction of Palestine, right? And finally, your elaborations about why these issues are insufficiently discussed. Because actually, you know, coincidentally or not, for a reading group today, you know, I was reading Lenin. And a lot of these Western Marxists seem to really, they seem to know their Lenin very well. They seem to have actually Lenin and also the Grandrist tattooed on their arms, right? They know every word by heart. And you know, Lenin is himself talking about how imperialism is a striving towards violence and reaction. It's based on increased national oppression. He's quoting Hoferding, how the movement for national independence threatens European capital. So I'm wondering how these basic insights from 100 years ago are no longer seemingly part of the Marxist canon. Why, how, if you can offer a bit of a political, kind of a sociology of knowledge that elaborates on why that is the case, and how we can collectively begin to resist that. So thanks again very much for your insights, and I look forward to your reply.
Yes, thank you for the comments. I will start first of all with the first point about shortening lives. You know, somehow when we're looking for a measure of surplus value, and there are many metrics on how to measure surplus value, and one of which is the residual. You know, someone worked 8 hours, he was paid 4 hours, and then there are 4 hours left or something like that. But again, that's in the one period production process, and that just arithmetic. It doesn't really say much about value being a relation, you know, with many moments. Value begins with the initial process is the objectification of labor, the process of making the commodity a form of labor, objectifying labor in the commodity. And that's concrete. That's a concrete process that existed since the beginning of history. People have to work with nature, and they put their labor into the earth. They're subject, and nature is object. And that relationship of subject to object, labor is mediated by labor, and produces a product from which we survive. Well, that process has been distorted under capitalism because again, as I said, the production relations have changed, and we don't produce things for use, we produce them to sell. And also, a better view of, you know, production serves somewhat to define for us a hypothetical lifetime. It doesn't really provide, it takes the totality of history into consideration, and how history is real time and progression. You know, when we speak of social, and then we speak of social reproduction, that's what I want to say. Social reproduction is a process by which what society uses and what it puts to use to earn things with. And we are governed by this value relationship, you know, because everything we made is intended to sell, and we need to sell more, and, you know, there needs to be more. The commodity needs to be cloned, like, and sold at many, much more and more and more, right? So there is that self-expanding value story to things, right? So in social reproduction, you know, it's no longer this hypothetical laborer who works. He's a social laborer, but he's a social laborer which cannot exist alone. He must exist within society, and he mediates, when he works, he mediates the what society has invested in, with probably some ingenuity of the person involved, but it's really society that's producing. And if all of society produces, the time of society is the time of life of society. It's not simply the 8 hours, 4 hours. Here we're speaking, you know, this society is going to maintain itself over a generation or two, so it has to work to keep something for itself in the waste share over time, such that it lives longer lives, because living longer life, you know, relative to the potential that is achieved elsewhere, is a metric that tells us, you know, people are doing better. For instance, China recently has a higher life expectancy than the United States, according to some measures. Some, you know, say they're the same or slightly different. Most measures say it's now higher than the United States. It started off in 1949 at around 30 years, 30, some say 30, some say 33, you know, but this generally, and too higher than the United States. So you can see, as a measure of development, this rise in life expectancy relative to the times, you know, because time cannot relate changes in life conditions between now and a century or 5 centuries earlier, because time is qualitative. And because time is the social time, time is the time of life, how we live, in a particular conditions relative to what is available to us but makes us reproduce ourselves. So in that sense, China is actually keeping much of the social product for itself and for its society to sustain a better standard of living. So it is auto-reproducing on a positive path, on a path which is healthy, a healthy path. Whereas in many societies, we see where, you know, that the conditions of science and the conditions of technology and the abundance of things, because we have a crisis, we have overproduction, we overproduce everything. Yet these societies, relative to the potential that is exercised, that is, we witness elsewhere, let's say in Japan or France, they're living to 50 or 60 years. For instance, in Afghanistan and Yemen, at some points, the life expectancy in war was less than 50 years, for instance. So, you know, I don't recall the numbers, but they're around the, you know, this space. So these, you know, when we say society, we're talking about the working class, because society in the end is the working class. And it's, people are organized in social classes, and social classes can be defined in many ways, but they're the most concrete way of defining a social class is the way people relate to the mode of production and how they reproduce themselves over time. So there are, most people are wage laborers. They work for a wage to sustain themselves. And so they relate to society as wage laborers. So, and they are the majority. So we can say that society is the working class. And since everybody around the world, since the production process around the world is integrated, and social classes don't have a national identity. I cannot say an American working class without really much qualifications, because I'm reducing what the concept, if the concept of class is about me working to make a living, then, and I am making a living in a global society that is that experiences an integrated production process, which that means that I am part of the international working class, and it is global society that produces. We cannot produce something here without getting something from here, or without suppressing something here. You know, the production process is complex and it's all interdependent, so it's global society that is producing. So in a global society that is in an international proletariat, in an international working class that is producing, there it is structured in as a two-tier system. There is a working class that's, you know, sort of lives off dividends that come from the underling working class in the developing world. And how does it live off these dividends? It, you know, as I said earlier, it needs, you know, they live in imperial structures that go to the developing world and extract lives before they extract. So the shortening of lives in the developing world, the extraction of life, is a shortening of life. It's a dampening of the potential for life, for more life expectancy. So if we're going to measure how much value is being drained, one metric, it's not the money, because the money is, and the accounts of capital are things which are created by capital to basically say, look, I deserve what I get because I have the better machines. But the better machines don't come out of thin air. The only reason they don't come because white people are more intelligent, they come because all of Africa and the rest of the world is detrimentally bombed to conditions that do not allow it to the luxury to make any machines or to have any universities or anything like that. They're starved, they suffer from neoliberal austerities, they're bombed, such that all the inventions and anything that works must be, you know, done in the. So the subject here, the subject of the better machines, is not the intelligence of white man. It is rather the cruelty of white man, in a sense, if you want to say, you know, use the word white man. That's the subject of history. So it's a social relation, really. It's not white or black or anything like that. The color is simply an ideological descriptor. So in a sense, the shorter the lives relative to the potential that people could live in the developing world is a metric measure of the surplus value that is being produced globally. It's a measure of the metric that's being produced globally, which brings me, I mean, I stopped and I said that, you know, surplus value has the word value in it, and value is a relation with many moments. The first moment is the concrete moment, the moment in which subject and object relate to each other, man and nature relate to each other, and man objectifies his labor in the product after working nature. And then the second moment is the moment in which this product of labor under capitalism is alienated from the laborer. And the third moment is that when this product of is alienated from the capitalist who has alienated and goes to the market and dictates to the capitalist what to do with socially necessary labor time to sustain an above average rate of profit in that market. And all of this is done. Again, the premise is we have a global society that produces not an American society, not a Congolese society, but a global society, because it's an interior. And classes don't have a national identity. Classes are conditions of being. They're ontological. I don't like the word, but there are conditions of being. People work to survive, and if they work and they produce more and they get the revenues from what they produce, they live better lives. As simple as that, and that occurs for an American, for an African, for a Latin American, for anybody. That's a condition of being. That's not a condition that one draws in the mind. And we want we want better conditions. We want better conditions for social reproduction, both social and environmental. And of course, as I said earlier, you know, capitalists benefit not only from making the social conditions bad, which shortens people's lives and increase the rate of exploitation, which makes the rate of surplus value higher. It also is going to create a lot of wasted environment, a lot of pollution that sells as well. So all the dirt that's being created, unfortunately, acts like a machine that destroys people as well and shortens life. So if we make too much pollution that's going to shorten lives, you know, it's like capital says, look, I made this pen, but I made 10 tons of pollution when I made this pen, and that 10 tons of pollution caused so many people to get sick and die early. So the pollution I created acts like a machine that kills for me, which I got gratis without paying any money for. So pollution is a sort of thing that capital makes that works as a machine for capital for which capital has not paid. There is more to the story. It's a really, so you can't ask capitalists to treat the environment. It's impossible. It is not like something that could be entertained, unless, of course, it's not about cutting profitability or cutting growth. It's about cutting capital as a social relationship. And cutting capital down as a social relationship means cutting the private property relation down. Because the private property relation is synodically, it's a sort of synonymous with the word capital, because private property says, well, you know, all the people made those things and I took them from them and I'm going to exclude them from what they made. And that's the same thing as capital by definition. So, you know, the idea of making the environment rejuvenate and making people rejuvenate and live better and healthier lives, it's a question of basically aiming at private property. Private property is synonymous with capital. Now that's a part that I talked about earlier. I should have, which brings me to sovereignty and popular democracy and people's autonomy and all the things that are, helpful to us in a sense. Well, in the value, you know, we go back to the very simple example of the value relationship. You know, I objectified my labor in the commodity. The commodity is a form of labor, but it's alienated from me and all of that. Now, alienated from me, that's the process of alienation, is a process of, that occurs how much of the commodity is alienated is by how much, what power my class exercises in the class struggle. So if I belong to a class that governs, that is in power, that represents the working class, but when the working class and when there is a dictatorship of the proletariat, dictatorship doesn't mean the same thing as Mussolini's type of dictatorship. Dictatorship was used in the 19th century to mean the rule of the proletariat. In American slang, it probably has this sort of connotation because of the Hollywood type culture that's been dominant and deluding for so long. Now, so the idea is when you have the rule of working people, what you're going to have is less alienation, less product alienation. The products of society will belong to society. And there'll be measures at the macro level to limit capital flight, to still capital controls, to boost agriculture, to nationalize the financial system, to create cooperatives that create scale economies in agriculture, and so on and so forth. So you're going to have all this process that's going to overturn that is going to overturn the process of alienation. What we're going to have is de-alienation, that we're going to own what we produce. And that's basically the antithesis, the anathema of the private property relation. That's a simple, that's how things work. And so when you see masses who say, look, to the Western, to the Western government structure and all this, they're saying, we don't want to give you what we have for very cheap prices. You cannot have our copper or our tin, and they must be able and ready to fight against a power that is, the capitalist power of the 15th century with the mindset. We think that Israel is a colonial settler power, but the Americans and the Europeans all think of the colonial by the colonial settler mindset. It's just, they're byproducts of each other. So it's not like apartheid South Africa was an anomaly, or the whole process is, and all of America and all of Australia is a settler colonial project, and that's the European project essentially. And that mindset is still there. And that mindset says, we need the products and the resources that these people have, their labor resources and their natural resources. And the way we're going to get this is by basically de-sovereignizing them, making sure that they don't enjoy any power against us when we negotiate. And worse yet, the process of disempowering the national classes in the developing world is an industry as well. So, I mean, when I mobilize my 5th Fleet and 6th Fleet and 10th Fleet and, my Marines and all of these things, right? I'm, mobilizing labor with machines to go and produce a certain amount of debt. And this is, of course, the way this is financed is by the treasury bills, which are bought by the financial institution, which are associated with rents, which means that the debt is associated with the rents, at least in this sphere. And because the debt of the fighting nation in the South has repercussions, because there's at a level of being, the working classes are all one working class, one international proletariat. So if one link weakens, the whole structure weakens. It's like a space-time continuum that sinks somewhere, if you like, right? So what you have is the defeat of some people, either in North Korea and Iran and Palestine. The defeat of peoples in those regions is a defeat for the international proletariat, which has spin-offs in the ideological components of the feeds the settler colonial mindset, which is to eliminate the other in order to get the resources of the other. They do eliminate. The settler colonial mindset is eliminate the other. And the process of elimination can be relative, gradual, or absolute, as many peoples in the Americas have perished. So that's the sort of picture one has in mind, which is quite realistic, I think.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that. That's a great segue to the question that has been upvoted. I'm finding a few questions here because I see similar trends of thoughts and questions. And I'm going to start with this. So in your book, you critique Western Marxism and argue that ahistorical theories of imperialism not grounded in history are a predicate without a subject. Can you explain what you mean by that? And relatably, you also criticize the methods used to characterize non-Western countries, such as China. You specifically talk about China, but we also know that the similar arguments are being made about other countries that challenge US imperialism. You argue that focusing on the symptoms of imperialism rather than its underlying dynamics overlook the core aspects of imperialism. So could you explain why it's essential to link control over space, time, and capital flow or value transfer to the center with military aggression to identify imperialism? And can you talk about why you think it's helpful to have our understanding of imperialism only as US-led imperialism, and concepts such as non-Western imperialism or sub-imperialisms that are used in some analysis are not theoretically helpful for our understanding?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for the question. Yes. Now, the point in imperialism, I mean, empires always must, take what the other has, some empires, but empires change. As I said, the historic, now we have an empire today, which is, let's say, the Western and, the American empire, for instance. For imperialism, so imperialism goes through stages. When we arrive at the 20th century, we see a new phenomenon. The phenomena is that finance, and cartels and monopolies are in control of the social production process. Finance and so when we see that transition from a system which was not led by finance to a system fully led by finance, money is leading the system. We say we have a capital which has a capital relations which has kicked into high gear. It is an intense capital relations because money, the turnover cycle of money, is a very rapid turnover cycle. So money makes money, we say, right? But if money makes money, when the real conditions have not yet, cannot, the time, we say the time and space that we have, we're working, we don't have trains yet. We don't have cars. We can't deliver the goods too fast. Our machines take a long time to produce things. Yet the money is making money somewhere that must have a corresponding value in the commodities that are being produced, in the wealth that is being produced. Then we have a new phenomenon. The commanding class is no longer an industrialist class. It is a financial class. There's a change in the class order. That started at around, at the beginning of the 20th century. This particular imperialism we call monopoly finance imperialism. And so when, the original theoreticians of those, they came and they said, look, we're seeing finance taking control, we're seeing concentration of capital, we're seeing the export of capital, we're seeing the centralization of capital, we're seeing wars over the divisions of the territories, and all of these things. Many of them mentioned these things: Lenin, Bukharin, Rosa Luxemburg, Hilferding. All of these guys mentioned those things, but Lenin had a cutting edge because of his power over method, where he says, look, now we're going to see that war is going to become the sole medium by which capital resolves its contradiction. Now, it is still, war is still the only medium in the 20th century, but the only reason, after the 1945 and the nuclear bomb, the nuclear deterrent is probably putting on some brakes. Otherwise, the reasons for war are always there, and the war is the only solution to the social problems, which is the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the reigning production relations. And Lenin has a specific mode of reasoning on this, and he says we're going to have wars all the time. So we should have more wars all the time, because we're going to have a crisis. First of all, the money is turning into money without a counter value in the real economy. So what is going to happen to the real economy? We need to increase the rate of exploitation so that we create a corresponding amount of wealth relative to the amount of fictitious money that we are creating because we have a financial war. This is a specific period under capitalism, which began in the 16th century. Its early forms were manufactura and cottage industry, mercantilism, and then the Industrial Revolution. And then we have this financial condition. And so finance is money turning into money and governing the pace at which production should proceed. Is going to cause havoc at the real level, because if I create $10 million out of thin air, I must create $10 million in the real economy. Well, that doesn't happen all the time, by the way. I'm not saying this is going to happen. The reason why we're going to have the wars is because there is going to be more money and no commodity. The contradiction will remain there. But I'm saying at least, they're going to ask people to work longer hours, die earlier, in worse conditions. We're going to kill the environment more and all. So it's like imperialism is the capital relations after drinking too much caffeine or something like that. It's like on amphetamines of sorts, right? So that's what imperialism is, right? But imperialism also has a structure. It has it has a body. It's embodied in imperialism at the beginning. Capitalism at the beginning did not occur as just as an idea. There were merchants who hired sailors who for the first time they paid these sailors parts of the loot, and this is how it all started. But then the loot was not something that they used themselves; it was something that they sold. See, that the reason is now under capitalism, we take things to sell them. We don't take things to use them. We're not, invading the other country for its corn. We're invading it for its gold, for its copper, we're not going to invade it for its tortillas or something like that. Like the tortillas are the last thing. Even tortillas, of course, they're made for profits. But anyways, so in a world structured like that, in a world structured, let's make things to sell them rather than use them, and make sure that at least they're sane when we use them and things like that. So that's what imperialism is. It's a historical period, that financial imperialism, which began at the beginning of the century. It continues today. The phenomena of capital on too much on speed, let's say, capital, on speed, the new phenomena, what we saw in the earlier 20th century was wars. In fact, there's everybody, even there's an interview, one of the last interviews with Friedrich Engels, he says, look, there's going to be a huge war very soon. And everybody could envisage the war. Or say there's a war coming. So there was a condition of nationalism and the war, saber rattling and war altogether then. But now what we see is a huge disaster at a planetary level and a huge environmental and social disaster. So if we think back to reason the necessary conditions, the necessary relations that from the beginning of the 20th century have led to this phenomenon of waste, of huge waste, wasted lives and wasted nature, we rethink the value relation. We rethink that this value relation and the progress of capitalism was really a sham. It was a chimera. It was never like it was thought about in the 19th century, that it will bring the railroads and it will bring progress. It did not. It is going to put an end to the planet, both socially and naturally. And it is the level of disease and the level of trash that we have accomplished and the amount of prematurely wasted lives that we have accomplished makes us rethink whether this value relationship was about converting use value into exchange value. It wasn't about that. It turned out that we have converted the disuse value, the anti-use value. The things that poison us are being sold to us, and we are consuming everything. So, you know, there's an economist called John B. Say, who says that supply creates its own demand 2 centuries ago. Well, then, you know, they said, look, you know, he's wrong because look at what Keynes did. Keynes says, let's pay a little bit more in wages. And if we pay a little bit more in wages, then we create demand, and the glut or the excess of supply will be, you know, will no longer pose a problem to the capitalists. There will not be inventories and so on and so forth, right? Well, now we are paying, you know, these implicit prices with the shorter lives that we're living because of the disaster that monopoly capitalism is. We are paying much more. We are consuming everything. We are consuming what's harmful to us, and we are paying for it. And that is due to the fact that the international working class is beaten into submission. It's not done. It is not dulled. People cannot be dulled. Everybody understands that they live in a hut or they live in a shanty town and their kids can't go to school and the system is rotten. Everybody understands. But the fact of the matter, the alternatives are taken away by theoreticians that pretend to be Marxists, specifically financed by the Western institutions and commanded by the Western institutions, that do not call the masses into struggle, all sorts of struggles against capital, that do not support the struggles of the developing world by all means possible, including primarily armed struggle, to stop NATO and the American bases from being present everywhere and imposing their conditions of trade. They extract lives in order to extract money. It's as simple as this. And these relationships, which are so obvious to all of us, that we need to basically adopt all the means of struggle against imperialism. So there isn't, when you say there is a sub-imperialism and things like that, and when I say it is a predicate, no, let us say that we have the world as a totality, which is the totality of social production relations. We are producing things in this world, right? If you take one unit out of this process, right? Think of Russia, for instance. They said Russia is going to fall right away, but Russia has grains and has phosphates and has, you know, specific units that basically sustain human life, but they count for very little of GDP, 1 or 2%. The percentages and the money form are misleading. They are built by capital. Everything, GDP, profit rates, money, it's all a fetish. It's all a sham. It's meant just to, you know, to delude people from the real process, because when you make profits, you don't make profits because you earn more money than you have spent. You make profits because you have beaten somebody into submissions to accept lower wages and low prices for their natural resources. That's why beating is the source of profits. Beating the masses is the source of the exploitation, and the oppression is the source of profits, not the money form, not the revenues that they report, right? So all these illusions, right? People are accepting those because they are beaten. They are literally beaten. They are beaten by hunger. They are beaten by disease. They are beaten by lack of education, by things we have too much of, but our crisis of overproduction necessitates a crisis of underconsumption. So what else? I mean, how are people not going, you know, and people are going to resort to the cultural values, to their history, Orientalism is not about saying, the others, as Edward Said said. Orientalism is, Anwar Abdul Malik says, which is to cut people off from their history, to rob them of their history, to rob them of their symbols of struggle against imperialism, and specifically the symbol of struggle by military means. That's the Orientalism. That's proposed by Anwar Abdul Malik. Right. So there isn't any sub-imperialism. Capital is not a socialist. It's a social relationship, and it's organic. It's an organic whole. There is one and only one. If you remove one of the things, the whole thing falls. One of the elements, the whole structure falls. It's not a question. Oh, it's 5% or something. That's not what subjective probabilities. It holds all together. Everybody counts in a system like that. Everybody counts for the same. Because without anyone, nothing works. And that's why human lives count in the developing world, just as much as, as in the developing world. Right?
Thank you so much, Ali. I want to turn to Max as well, if you want to add your thoughts to this question before we have around 7 minutes or less. So if we can be brief with responses, so we can get into maybe 1 or 2 more questions as well, that would be great. But before I do so, I'll turn to you, Max.
Yes, thank you, Helyeh, and thank you, Ali, for that very clarifying comment. I think it really puts it into very sharp relief. I think the thing that can be added, although quantitative indices don't tell us everything, and arithmetic is an empiricism or often a tool of reactions we learned from you, we are capable of learning some things from some basic arithmetic when we look at these states that are actually alleged to be imperialist or sub-imperialist, right? I mean, if we look at actually what is the Chinese value flow, that is, how much value is China importing from Africa and Latin America and its surrounds in Southeast Asia versus how much value is it exporting to Europe and the United States? Okay, it's a net value exporter, right? This is very easy to prove arithmetically, right? So it's alleged to be imperialism. Primarily, actually, once we actually do the work of investigation, what we find beneath the accusation of or we can say the pseudo-social scientific construction of imperialism is actually just a demonization campaign, right? It's actually, in effect, an intention to calumniate China, right? And just say, okay, this place is bad, right? And this actually doesn't rise to the level of serious inquiry, right? Actually, it should be beneath us to actually be thinking, okay, good, bad. Right, this is not a serious realm of social scientific inquiry, unfortunately. I mean, when it comes to Iran, of course, it's even worse, right? Iran is actually having its net, imperialism has actually devastated the overall productive forces historically of Iran, and the places where Iran is alleged to be doing an imperialism, right? And I believe the esteemed colleague David Harvey actually put his name at a petition stating that Iran was doing a sub-imperialism in Palestine or in Lebanon. I mean, Iran is doing monopoly finance capital exports to Palestine and Lebanon, or Iraq, where it just happens to be a historic trading partner going back thousands of years, right? These are just actually arguments that only have an edifice of the power underlying them rather than any sort of rational argumentation, right? So it's actually, if we take ourselves seriously as scholars, right, in fact, these arguments are actually insults to our intellectual integrity. That's what I think we should keep in mind.
In a sense, there is something, this surplus value is not simply the things we produce, it's also the ideas, and the knowledge and everything. So surplus value is a social relation. A social relation is abstract, but real, with real effects. It's not abstract, it's not touchable, it's intangible, but it's real. It has, it's a power relation, and it makes things. It has real effects. So, this idea that this historical surplus value is the amount of knowledge and wealth under the command of the Western Hemisphere, which composes the weight of history. Now, what purpose does it serve? How is wealth being accumulated? By the utilization of this huge store of knowledge and wealth to dispossess people everywhere, and dispossess them by violence, all sorts of violence, including structural genocide, and direct genocide. So if it's not by structural genocide, it's not by hunger, disease, and all the things that are created under conditions when we have so much, but yet we have hunger and things like that, so on, but also by war and so on. So you have a situation where this historical surplus value, something it's used by Abdul Malik. I used I've taken something, also borrowed something, and I said it's the weight of history. And the way it's described is that when you have this aura of power and you have so much power, you don't need to tell your slaves what to do. Your slaves will do what you want them to do automatically, reflexively. They will act to do that. And if they don't, or they don't, you will always have to aggress them. In order to make more profits, more surplus value, you always have to aggress them. So we live in a world where there is a huge historical surplus value, a weight of history, the dollar domination, the knowledge domination, everything, which everybody is deprived of, and they're used as an enemy. And then you have some nations, some parts of the international proletariat, like China and others, who are saying, look, we're going to keep something for ourselves. And we're worried because you accumulate by violent dispossession. We're worried that you're going to destroy us. So when Iran, for instance, looks for partners against American imperialism in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and Lebanon, it's doing so in a position of self-defense. One must look at the balance of power and the weight of history. Who owns it? Who's got the capacity, and who's got the track record of exterminating anything that comes in its way in order to raise profits? It's a modus vivendi for capital. This exterminate to make profit is the modus vivendi. It is the origin, it is the basis of capital. That's how capital lives. So, for people who don't want to die, Chinese, Iranians, North Koreans, Cubans, they don't want to die early. They want to, they want to say, look, we don't want to be like Egypt. We don't want to be like an African country that is now following the diktats of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. We don't want to be like that. We want to have our own agriculture. We want to produce our own food, which is the most important, the basic step for any national sovereignty project. And when they say that, they're going to be bombed. And when they know they're going to be bombed, everybody knows it's a clear thing. We know that the United States will bomb them and the Europeans. I mean, if you look at the WTO agreements, the reason why they all, hit a bottleneck or hit an obstacle is when agriculture comes into the picture, and agriculture doesn't count for much out of the world trade. Yet, especially agriculture and subsistence goods. But when it comes to saying, look, you are subsidizing your farmers in the north to the tune of trillions of dollars. Bangladesh can send you all the food you want, but of course they will not accept that because the food security is part of the national security. They cannot rely on a developing country for their food. The developing country must rely on them for their food and on the money that they pay to substitute for the food. So that's imperialism. Imperialism is not about percentage of this or there is a little bit of things when you study psychology, for instance, a first-year psychology student, and he's reading about all the psychological illnesses, the professor would say, look, beware, you were all going to have some symptoms of what the prognosis or what the description of the disease is, but that doesn't mean we're sick. We all drew a mustache on somebody, on some picture on the wall, but doesn't mean we have psychosis or neurosis. I don't know. You see, so it's not because a grocery store exports capital from one country to another, sends money to his mother, he's an imperialist or something like that. Imperialism is about making sure that the wealth of all the countries is under the control. It's dollarized, and I own it. And it all comes to me, and the people there are not going to keep anything for themselves. I want them to perish early, to suffer from premature death. That's what imperialism is. And every country in the world is in a position of self-defense against US imperialism. China is in a position of self-defense against US imperialism. The Palestinians are in a position of self-defense. They are not aggressors. They have been dispossessed, they have been thrown out, they have been genocided. They are in a position of self-defense. Nelson Mandela says, we are in a position, when he fought for the national liberty, we are in a position of self-defense. So it's not an argument of some people attacking, it is an argument of people defending themselves against the necessary and impending aggression of the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because at the level of being, they make their money by extermination. They have a history of extermination. One measure of how many people they've exterminated since 1500 is 900 million people. That's something, nearly a billion people, right? I mean, looking at one measure was about 400 million between 1500 and 1900, and there is about 500 million people in the 20th century between structural and direct genocide. So I don't know the number, but the numbers are huge. So it's a process that is going to make the planet extinct, not only humans, also nature extinct. And it's making nature extinct because, as I said, nature is a machine that capital, by short-changing society, creates the trash, which acts like an additional machine that produces dead people. And the dead people and the sickness that the trash produces is commoditized, it's priced, and it influences in a price structure that is complex and interrelated. Everything is connected with everything, and it influences everything. And and when the dialectic is a negative dialectic, when things are going from bad to worse because the laws of value have become the laws of waste, you're going to get to where we are. And the solution is very simple. People know, but the theoreticians and the vanguard must go back to the positions of the 70s about the necessity of struggles by all means against American imperialism and its cronies in the developing world.
I hate to stop you. I wish we had more time. We also can't get to any more questions, unfortunately, although they were very important questions that we need to continue this discussion for. So I wanna stop here and thank you both so much. This has been incredibly insightful and clarifying. And I think at a time we all need to sharpen our analysis to better understand what's taking place in the world. So we really, really appreciate you both for taking the time to be with us. I know it's also late and we're in very different time zones. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us. So be sure to follow the LPE Project to know what's happening with us. We're organizing a lot of good programs in the upcoming months, and we really hope that we can have both Ali and Max come back to us to continue this conversation as well. So thank you both so much, and hopefully we'll see you in our future programs.
Oh, thank you. Very nice.
Thank you.